Welcome everyone. Today's webinar is being recorded. You should be at the RISE AmeriCorps request for proposals. You're speaking with Adam Donaldson. I am the National and Community Service Program Specialist at the Rhode Island Department of Education. And along with my colleague, Amanda Forget, who's helping me with the chat and making sure we stay on task today and can answer questions as well. We're responsible for AmeriCorps grant making here in Rhode Island through the State Commission for National and Community Service. And we're talking today about RISE AmeriCorps. You may be more familiar these days with virtual meetings where everyone has the Brady Bunch window and you can see each other on audio and video. We are in a webinar format today. That means that you currently don't have the ability to be on camera, to unmute, or to speak. If you want to communicate with me, please do type a question into the chat feature. You can also use the raise your hand button. And in theory, I will see that in my participant window and call on you and give you the ability to address a question. During the presentation today, there will be specific breaks where we get through some material and I go back and look at the chat specifically, give you the opportunity to unmute and ask a question for that section of the presentation. And just one more call out, we'd love for everyone to say hello in the chat and understand how you learned about this webinar today by giving us a little statement that you heard about it from a colleague, you read about this RFP from the Rhode Island Department of Education, social media posts, etc. So hold on to your hats because here we go. We really have three goals for spending the next 90 minutes together. One is to understand the purpose of AmeriCorps. Two is to be able to identify that there are actually three different AmeriCorps resources that I want you to know about, one of which is the RISE AmeriCorps RFP, and also make sure that you're better prepared to respond to the RFP that we've posted. Right, that's really our main goal. So let's talk about the Rhode Island Service Experience. I want to first acknowledge and thank the organizations out there for providing aid to Rhode Islanders while working to sustain your own institutions and your workforce during this COVID-19 pandemic. I know it hasn't been easy, and it's my sincere hope that what I'm presenting today will help build your capacity to do more good better. To help folks unfamiliar with our AmeriCorps program, we added a description of what is created through this grant resource, and that is a Rhode Island Service Experience. You will be creating new positions at your organization and inviting folks to long-term volunteer assignments through AmeriCorps that rise to the challenges that are facing your community. We really hope that this will extend your reach, that we will provide people power through AmeriCorps positions to increase the capacity of your organization to serve more kids, more families, more neighbors in your community. And we hope that these participants in AmeriCorps will bring new perspectives and diversity to your organizations, new cultural competencies because of their own backgrounds and lived experiences. We hope that you will share with us the important responsibility of developing new leaders in Rhode Island. AmeriCorps provides a hands-on experience where folks develop new skills and continue to perhaps work at your organization in the future or find a new path to strengthen Rhode Island in their career or further education. And we hope that through the Rhode Island Service Experience, we can help raise the profile of your work We are a federal and state and local partnership where there are numerous opportunities to highlight and promote the work that your organization does to other leaders in our state, elected leaders, additional funders, through events and activities that we sponsor. But the RISE AmeriCorps, the second part is AmeriCorps. So AmeriCorps is a federal program. It works with states and local organizations created through the National Community Service Trust Act of 1993. Its history is rooted in the American idea of the power to assemble or mobilize for mutual aid. Each year, there are more than 250,000 AmeriCorps members and AmeriCorps senior volunteers who serve with organizations to tackle pressing challenges. People serve in more than 45,000 locations nationwide, and AmeriCorps helps make service to others a cornerstone of our national culture. In Rhode Island, there are annually several hundred AmeriCorps members and over 2,000 AmeriCorps senior volunteers. AmeriCorps programs in Rhode Island have double duty. They work both to enrich the lives of those we serve and those who serve by providing a pathway to education and career post-service. So the AmeriCorps member is at the center of this story. The basic requirements to be an AmeriCorps member are written out in federal legislation. AmeriCorps members are participants age 17 or older, all ages up into the hundreds, serving in AmeriCorps in Rhode Island. Participants must have or be working toward a high school diploma. The majority of AmeriCorps members in Rhode Island do have a college degree or some college credits. Participants must be citizens or have permanent resident status. AmeriCorps has an enrollment process that verifies this citizenship status. Participants must also go through a thorough criminal history screening that we will explain to awarded grantees and is detailed in the request for proposal. Failure by programs to properly screen folks' criminal history the way that AmeriCorps instructs can result in repayment of grant funds. It's taken very seriously to safeguard the children, the families, and older adults who are receiving services from the AmeriCorps members. But you, the organization that has created this position for the service experience, will determine the other characteristics and skills that are needed for your specific program. And what that program is will really be up to you. The older slogan for AmeriCorps is to get things done. You are going to design a program to address any community need. That might be educating students. It might be supporting veterans and military families, preserving the environment, or helping our communities recover from COVID-19. I think Amanda and I both look forward to hearing what types of programs and innovative ideas you have for putting service into action. But RISE AmeriCorps members generally perform direct service. This means that they have direct contact with the beneficiary of programs. Their administrative or office tasks are generally limited. AmeriCorps members, by legislation that created AmeriCorps, should also participate in recruiting and supporting additional volunteers during their term of service at some point or other, or it can be the entire point of their position. The idea here being to leverage and grow volunteerism generally. The experience of the program that you design must also include training and opportunities for the AmeriCorps member to reflect on their service, to inspire them to make a commitment to service and to find a new career or education pathway once they're done. So there's a lot. However, there are also some things that AmeriCorps members are not able to do. I want to make sure that you are aware of them immediately. We refer to them in AmeriCorps language as prohibited activities. These are, for example, attempting to influence legislation, anything related to elections, making political statements, participating in voter registration, even the census are prohibited activities. Also, assisting, promoting, or interfering with union organizing is a prohibited activity. AmeriCorps members are not permitted to engage in religious instruction. This doesn't mean that they can't serve with and alongside religious institutions, but not if the purpose is religious instruction. They cannot provide services that benefit a business or be involved in certain aspects of reproductive health. These are requirements from the federal program. Another important thing to understand is we'll be looking at your application to determine if there's any supplanting of activities, volunteers, or paid employees that would occur if the AmeriCorps program wasn't started. We cannot supplant or duplicate existing programs. When an AmeriCorps member serves with your organization through this grant program, they're going to access some benefits. They can receive a living allowance, like a wage, but not an hourly wage. It is a cash stipend paid weekly or bi-weekly. They also will obtain an education award from AmeriCorps if they successfully complete their year of service. It's a fundamental part of the structure of this program that when you complete service, your service is recognized with money to repay student loans or pay tuition in the future, or to pass on to a grandchild if you're an older adult. Many individuals, however, think of the benefit of service in personal terms, cultural terms, or religious terms, giving back to the community. AmeriCorps is also just a fun adventure that many folks look to for a way to meet the moment, address what is going on in communities across Rhode Island today. Especially, we have to always say these days, coming out, finished with the COVID-19 pandemic, or the phrase you're tired of, the new normal. I just want to highlight the Education Award so that you're aware of how that works. It is not part of the grants program, but is separately provided by AmeriCorps, an institution called the National Service Trust. The Education Award amount changes with the number of hours that an individual completes in their AmeriCorps position. And next year, the maximum is $6,495 for someone who completes sort of a full-time AmeriCorps position, roughly 40 hours a week over the course of a year. So AmeriCorps is an internship, a fellowship, a volunteer job. Yes, but it is, AmeriCorps is really just AmeriCorps. It's all of these things, it's more of these things. AmeriCorps members are legally not employees, but are participants in a program like the Peace Corps, and the rules that are established for them are defined in federal legislation and uniquely part of the AmeriCorps program. I want to just pause from my lecture format and see if in this general introduction of all things AmeriCorps, there are any questions that have been generated. I haven't seen any in the chat. If anyone would like the opportunity to raise their hand and be allowed to talk, let me know. Just wait for a minute or ask that you use the chat if you have any questions. Hopefully, AmeriCorps is so famous. We've done such a good job of raising awareness that I've lulled you by repeating information you already were familiar with. Okay, so part 2. I want to make sure that you understand that RISE AmeriCorps is not the only resource available to you. It's an important part of my job to kind of talk about the fact that AmeriCorps is a complex network and there are distinct programs and resources available to you. We often call the different programs streams of service, and there are 2 main divisions in AmeriCorps. One is called AmeriCorps Seniors, a series of programs that engage older adults age 55 and older in some very specific programs. And then there are all the other folks in AmeriCorps. That's really what I'm going to focus on. There are 3 branches in AmeriCorps proper, and Triple C, Vista, and State and National. And the grant opportunity we're talking about today is part of that state and national network. So let's make sure we first know about AmeriCorps and Triple C instead. The National Civilian Community Corps, a full-time residential program for men and women, specifically ages 17 to 26, who live together in a dormitory and travel throughout the region, completing what are called spikes of service activity. So AmeriCorps members actually live together in Vicksburg, Mississippi, and will travel to Rhode Island for 6 to 12 weeks at a time, continue traveling throughout New England, and complete service projects that have been designed perhaps by you, their project sponsor. AmeriCorps and Triple C is known for disaster recovery efforts, buildings with Habitat for Humanity. Here in Rhode Island, they've worked primarily with land trusts and doing farm projects. They've served in summer vacation camps, after school camps, programs, and an NCCC FEMA Corps team supported vaccination sites in Rhode Island last year. The project sponsor provides a meaningful service opportunity, supervision of the AmeriCorps members while they're here, and arranges for housing during their visit to Rhode Island. There is no financial assistance that comes from the project, either from AmeriCorps or to AmeriCorps from you, the project sponsor. The only requirement is that housing be arranged for these AmeriCorps members while they are here. I will say that due to the fact that there are very few applications on an annual basis that come from Rhode Island for an AmeriCorps and Triple C team, this resource is not highly competitive. It is a matter of applying and going through all the steps and making sure that you have a good project in mind and are ready to be a good host. So you should learn more about that if you're interested by referring to Google, of course, asking me, or going to serverisland.com/AmeriCorps grants, where we talk more about AmeriCorps and Triple C. I also want to make sure that you know about AmeriCorps Vista, Volunteers in Service to America. This provides full-time AmeriCorps members to nonprofits, faith-based and other community organizations, public agencies, to create and expand programs specifically that bring low-income individuals and communities out of poverty. It is an anti-poverty program. AmeriCorps Vista is a program designed for members to do indirect service or capacity building efforts. Most often, Vistas serve as a single member at a small agency or as part of a cohort that are all involved in a similar project spread across several different agencies. There are AmeriCorps Vistas in Rhode Island that are recruiting additional volunteers, fundraising, designing new programs, working on data and assessment projects to expand access to art, to reduce homelessness, prevent opioid abuse, provide healthcare, increase college enrollment. The list of projects is quite expansive. What's consistent about AmeriCorps Vista is being able to describe a sustainability plan after the AmeriCorps Vista is done with their term of service, and that the beneficiaries are folks who can be described as low income from the federal definition. AmeriCorps awards a certain number of Vista positions to a sponsor and can provide the benefits like living allowance directly to the Vista. The sponsor provides local operating and logistics and hosts the AmeriCorps Vista position, but generally speaking, does not receive any funding directly from AmeriCorps itself. But the AmeriCorps and Triple C program I mentioned comes from Vicksburg, Mississippi, and they are the ones who an applicant works with to determine if a project can start. With AmeriCorps Vista, there is a Northeast office located in New Hampshire that serves all of New England and the state of New York. And they are the ones who manage the Vista application process. You can get in touch with them most easily by emailing ri@cns.gov. And again, this information is available at serverisland.com/AmeriCorps grants as well. And let's look at a question in the chat here. Volunteers. It's being answered. There's a question about supplanting in the chat, and Amanda Forget has answered that. I direct everyone to look at the chat to understand what's happening there. But if you're expanding your activity, generally speaking, that's going to be fine. That's not going to be an issue of supplanting. I think the most obvious example of supplanting is when something is more egregious, when employees have been let go recently, and then AmeriCorps members are invited in to do the same duties and services that a former employee had. There's a very obvious sign of supplanting. So our activity, what we're responsible for, is the largest national service program in terms of people and in terms of resources, AmeriCorps, state and national. These programs recruit, train, and place AmeriCorps members to meet critical community needs. Members perform a range of direct service activities, as I described before. Programs get designated national when they actually operate in multiple states. In Rhode Island, for example, you may be familiar with the organization City Year Providence. City Year operates in more than 20 communities across the country and is a national AmeriCorps program. When a program exists solely within one state, they get the designation AmeriCorps State, and they work with their state commission here, ServeRI, at the Rhode Island Department of Education. And we're not advancing. There we go. To try and explain this in Rhode Island, we've had a long tradition started before me of describing how the layers of the AmeriCorps state and national landscape support the AmeriCorps members in service. And it happily looks like a cake. So we'll take a minute just to kind of go through this. But you have the federal agency AmeriCorps, which provides grant funds to ServeRI here at the Department of Education to promote AmeriCorps, to provide technical assistance to AmeriCorps programs, to gather AmeriCorps members for special events and training, and award subgrants to community organizations or AmeriCorps programs. That's you. Boom. ServeRI, being the state commission, we are a pass-through entity, making subawards to your organization in Rhode Island, providing, yeah. In particular, we have hosted a lot of events to bring all of our grantees together in addition to the grants for civic reflection and a social justice program we call Justice Talks for AmeriCorps members. The AmeriCorps program, you will receive and manage the grant from ServeRI and then recruit, train, and supervise a team of AmeriCorps members. In most cases, your program might partner with other organizations, schools, other agencies, where the AmeriCorps member will actually do their service on a day-to-day basis. And in this case, we talk about those partners as service sites, which may be involved in the daily supervision of the AmeriCorps member, depending on your model. Okay, when I click on the chat, it makes me not able to advance the presentation slides. So just to recap, ServeRI is the brand name for the public authority responsible for managing AmeriCorps state grants in Rhode Island, the RISE AmeriCorps. Every state has a commission for national community service, which is a governor-appointed volunteer board. And here we're housed at the Rhode Island Department of Education for staffing and administrative support. The Commissioner of Education in Rhode Island is actually designated as the chair of the volunteer ServeRI board, or the commissioner can designate an individual. That position is currently filled by Brian Darrow, Chief Strategy Officer. We have a strategic plan. It's one of the main responsibilities of ServeRI, the state service plan for 2020 to 2023, which provides more detail on our mission to catalyze inclusive service opportunities to strengthen Rhode Island. We generally believe that service and volunteer programs do more than help communities move forward. They serve participants by providing pathways to new career, education, and leadership opportunities. But in the moment, all we really need to know is that ServeRI, Adam and Amanda staffing, are responsible for this annual AmeriCorps grant process. So we're going to pause there again and see if there are any specific questions that have come in. We're making good time. I would just encourage you to take a sip of coffee. If you've got a swivel chair, make a full circle, stretch your arms, bend back to the elbow. We've got some humor in the chat, so don't ignore it, but but no questions, I don't think. Thank you, Amanda. All right, let's get into it. The real deal here, being better prepared to respond to the ServeRI RFP. I want to be very clear that our request for proposal says that you identify a need. You can pursue any area of community need through this AmeriCorps grant program. There are some stated priorities in our state service plan, and they are nice, but not necessary for your proposal to address. Also in this RFP, we describe that there are 13 out of 100 points available in the scoring process for addressing the priorities that are listed. That's primarily alignment with the state service plan, as well as being aligned with serving in communities that the state has designated as the most vulnerable, most affected in the COVID-19 pandemic. Those are Central Falls, East Providence, Johnston, Newport, North Providence, Pawtucket, Providence, Warwick, West Warwick, and Woonsocket. We also describe in the RFP academic tutoring as a current annual priority in this process, and another priority, engaging older adults in service. Again, while there are additional points in the scoring process, when an applicant is aligned with these priorities, we are interested in meeting all the needs of Rhode Island through service positions. There's some questions in the chat that we're about to address as we go forward. And we'll come back and see if we hit them all. So eligibility, you are eligible to apply. If you're a nonprofit, a school or a government agency, faith-based agency, you are eligible to apply for this grant program unless your primary purpose is making money or lobbying government, or you've previously been convicted of a federal crime. You are all eligible to apply. In the RFP, we describe that this particular grant program is to receive 2 years of funding starting July 1, 2022 and continuing through June 30th, 2024. These are our state fiscal years. Now, when you are awarded an AmeriCorps grant, you make an application for a 1-year period of activity and funding. And then at this time in the future, you do what's called a continuation. So you can apply for changes if you want, and you submit a revised budget at that time in a small application. We call it continuation, but you will have a program for 2 years. The grants vary slightly as described in the RFP, but the basic concept is we are awarding $25,000 for what's called a member service year. And depending on what type of program you have described, applied for, that will change the number of member service years. So it's important to understand, what is he talking about? Unlike other grants that announce, we're going to give you $50,000 if you generally do these things, AmeriCorps grants are structured based on the number of AmeriCorps members and the expected number of hours that they will perform in different terms of service. So to understand the amount of funding that would be provided for your project, you first need to determine how many participants in AmeriCorps are you looking to support, and how many hours over the course of a year do you want them to perform. And this can vary because they may serve 2 hours every day, 42 hours every day, or they may only serve on Saturdays. They may only serve in June and July and not the rest of the year. There's a lot of variation in how AmeriCorps programs are designed. So the RFP describes how to calculate the member service years by using the table that we have on this screen. So just for an example, if you have designed a program where you have 4 AmeriCorps members who are working through your agency 40 hours a week, all year long, and completing a full-time 1,700-hour AmeriCorps position, you are going to enter that in the table as shown in this example. And then maybe you have a specific summer-only activity where an additional 24 AmeriCorps members are volunteering for a concentrated period of time over the course of the summer. And so you're going to enter that on that line and multiply it by these very specific AmeriCorps designated calculation numbers. And you'll see that the math here is 9.08. Your member service years in this particular scenario are 9.08. That member service year gets multiplied by the $25,000 to determine the amount of the award that you are eligible for. Individual cases, we will certainly help you with this on a case-by-case basis, but that is the general outline of how these grants are structured. So I want to go to the chat. So in general, $25,000. AmeriCorps members have 12 months to complete a term of service. They can then enroll again in AmeriCorps in a second year of service. There are some more specific rules that we can provide information about the number of terms of service that any individual can participate in AmeriCorps. This grant period is specifically, again, aligned with the Rhode Island state fiscal year, which means that the budget period is July 1 to June 30th for your project. That may mean your project starts in October, where members actually begin training, or they could start in July. The activity and the budget period may differ, but the grant, generally speaking, is going to be from July 1 to June 30th. This RFP specifically describes that there are 4 different, well, really 5, one being the continuation, which we're not going to discuss today, but there are 4 different new grant opportunities described in this RFP. The RISE AmeriCorps Fixed Grant, the RISE Professional Corps Fixed Grant, the Intermediary Cost Reimbursement Grant, and Planning Grant. And I think it's worth spending 10-15 minutes to make sure that we understand what the differences are between these. So we're going to do that. They come with them a few different requirements in terms of the minimum size of the project that needs a threshold that needs to be met in order to have AmeriCorps application be successful. They have different funding structures, both in terms of the amount of funding available per MSY, and also whether or not there's a budget where you need to demonstrate a local contribution. So we're going to talk about those. I'm going to talk about those details and then look forward to your questions. First is the RISE AmeriCorps fixed grant. Really trying to aim here to reduce administrative burden for you and more efficiently support growing your AmeriCorps program and supporting the capacity of Rhode Island's nonprofit sector through these grants. Fixed grant recipients, most importantly, will receive grant payment on a monthly basis based on the records you keep for the AmeriCorps members' service hours. So there's a fixed amount of money, $25,000, which is paid to you based on the number of AmeriCorps members times the number of hours that each one of them completed. So if in a given month, no AmeriCorps members completed service, then the monthly payment would be $0. But in a given month where 1 hour was completed, there would be $25,000 prorated into that 1 hour. It's important to understand that in this grant, the disadvantage here was, in my example, if AmeriCorps members do not serve, if they are not enrolled into their positions and recording hours, then payment will not be made by ServeRI, because we need to see that AmeriCorps members have completed timesheets, and that is how the grant is paid. So because of that, there is no budget. You decide how to spend those dollars when you receive them. It might be for living allowance. It might be for staffing. It might be for a t-shirt with an AmeriCorps logo or a criminal history background check, but that's completely within your purview to decide how the money is spent. With these types of grants, there is no match requirements. You are not required to demonstrate that you, through a budget process or reporting against a budget, that you have spent additional funds, which means, in addition to reducing that administrative burden, we also reduce the risk to you of audit findings if your financial records are missing information. What's important to understand about these fixed grants is we, ServeRI, will be working with you to provide an online timesheet system to really make it very efficient for understanding how many hours have been performed and providing a formula so that you know what your grant payment is going to be for that month. You at the organization will use potentially other resources to cover any remaining costs in the project. Now, we have set a pretty low threshold of having a minimum of 2 members or 2 member service years, the equivalent of 2 member service years in a combination of shorter hour positions in order to be eligible to receive a fixed grant. Otherwise, what the members are doing, what community need they address, all other aspects of this grant are the same as what we'll describe as a cost reimbursement intermediary. This is just a different system of payment, the fixed versus being cost reimbursed. Another type of fixed grant does exist. It's called the professional core. Professional core refers to the fact that this particular grant program seeks to address when there's a shortage of certified professionals in a specific area. So for example, if there are few teachers applying for open positions, or perhaps licensed healthcare workers of some type, those would be professions that are experiencing a shortage. Certified daycare workers. When you can demonstrate that there's a shortage of that profession, and you believe that the incentive of an AmeriCorps Education Award and designing it as a service experience would help fill the workforce need, you can apply for a fixed grant that will give you $1,000 to support the general administration of the project, as well as the fact that they will serve and earn an AmeriCorps Education Award. However, as professionals, they are paid by employers in the profession they're in. So there aren't additional grant funds that are tied to this type of program. It is only $1,000 per MSY to support the recruitment and enrollment process of that AmeriCorps member, and then the creation of a national service position so that they can earn an education award. Just as an example of this, the most familiar one to folks across the country because of the building of their brand is Teach for America. Teach for America exists as a professional core fixed grant program. I am going to come back and address questions that I see in the chat. So we talked about the two fixed grants. The other two grants are cost reimbursement. That's probably a more familiar way of grant making to most organizations from public institutions. That is where you have a set budget and you get reimbursed by reporting that you've incurred costs, right? Cost reimbursement. We believe that to manage a greater number of AmeriCorps members and achieve either greater geographic reach or increase the number of beneficiaries that are served, there's a very proven model where an organization serves as an intermediary, develops its application to oversee the implementation of AmeriCorps program that engages multiple community-based organizations, schools, or public partners as host sites. And while each participant may not have the necessary program management or fundraising capacity to carry out an AmeriCorps project, a consortium together can be very effective. So applicants for an intermediary cost reimbursement grant submit a full project budget that identifies costs allocated to the grant and also costs that will be borne by the intermediary, what's referred to in the budget as the grantee share. Cost reimbursement grants fund a portion of the project operating costs, the member living allowance, with a flexibility to use all of the funds for the allowable costs in the budget. Cost reimbursement grants do include a statutory grantee matching requirement by AmeriCorps. and require the submission of a budget and monthly financial reports. Payment is made based on these reports of actual expenditures. Recipients must follow acceptable accounting practices and be available to show records of financial transactions if selected for fiscal monitoring by the Rhode Island Department of Education, our administrative home. In contrast to fixed grants, reimbursement is not aligned with the completion of AmeriCorps service hours, but 1, to the costs actually incurred, and 2, demonstrating that the grantee is meeting its match requirements. Members can serve in any type of position, part-time or full-time schedules. When we talk about match requirement, we're talking about the fact that in addition to the funding you receive when you submit a budget in the application process, there needs to be at least 24% additional funding that is being provided by you, the AmeriCorps host agency. Well, oftentimes, this money exceeds 24%, but 24% is the minimum for a new project. This is described in quite a lot of detail in the RFP itself. But when you make a budget for a cost reimbursement grant, you're going to designate the source of the funding is either from the grant, the CNCS share, or is being provided by the grantee, either as something that's cash or provided by a partner in kind. And then you'll have a column where these are combined into the total. And so just as an example on this slide, if you were requesting to have to have $175,000 in grant funding, and you had a 24% minimum match, you can see there, I've done the math, that you're going to need to have $55,263 in your budget that is coming from other sources that are not AmeriCorps. Now, during your program implementation to receive grant payment in your monthly report, you'll need to demonstrate that you achieved that 24% match in order to receive payment for the other expenses that you incurred. I want to address the, first there's a question about the planning grants. Is there a concept paper for the planning grants? The answer is no, there's not a concept paper for a planning grant. If you would like to submit some information that you think is relevant and receive feedback in the same way that the concept paper is designed, you may do that, but there's no requirement to submit a concept paper for a planning grant. There's a lot of questions about how the funding is determined and how the funding can be used. These are really decisions that you will make, whether you're applying for a fixed grant and receiving that $25,000 in relation to the number of member service years, or whether you're getting a cost reimbursement grant where you've provided a specific budget that's been approved for allowable expenses. You're going to determine whether or not that grant pays for a living allowance that you determine for the AmeriCorps member, whether or not you're providing health care and what that cost is, whether or not you have a training program that costs a certain amount and you have that in the budget. These are all decisions that are going to be yours. And as we'll mention future in the presentation, we will have a specific webinar just on AmeriCorps budgeting because it's kind of outside the scope of our time here together. So I just want to mention that there is an opportunity to receive a planning grant. The planning grant is exactly how it sounds. Rather than providing AmeriCorps member positions, there's a way where you can ask for funding to spend a year period with us planning for a future AmeriCorps program. You do submit a budget, and in general, we like to see a minimum of at least the equivalent of 0.25, 25% time of an individual who will be working on this planning grant. And it still comes with the match requirement because it is a cost reimbursement grant. There is in the RFP additional pages that describe the planning grant, ask different questions than the other grants in terms of the application, and with a slightly different scoring model because the questions are different. But you're going to explore if an AmeriCorps program is feasible and achieve design elements like the logic model, the theory of change, build your organizational capacity to host AmeriCorps members. We really feel that planning grants are an important tool to help organizations become better prepared to compete for future AmeriCorps program grants. But planning grants are not a guarantee that organizations can obtain an AmeriCorps grant in the future. Applicants who are successful in receiving a planning grant have to agree to meet with ServeRI staff or a designated consultant on a monthly basis to show program toward milestones that are agreed upon. Some of these milestones include having a logic model, determining what performance measures will be part of your program, developing your budget, having a recruitment plan, having a training plan, some of those kind of basic things so that you're ready to not only submit an application, but actually be prepared to run a program. I want to address living allowance before we move forward from the grant types because it's so central to this question of funding. When you design your AmeriCorps program, we said that you'll identify the number of AmeriCorps members that'll be placed and how many volunteer hours you feel that they'll complete in their schedule. We describe these as slot types or terms of service interchangeably. The 1,700 hours is our traditional slot type, the equivalent to a full-time worker over a 10 or 12-month period. And our state commission requires that if you engage someone in a 17-hour term of service, you must minimally provide them with $18,000 in living allowance. AmeriCorps, as a federal program, also sets a maximum level of living allowance an individual can receive in a national service position. Now, the living allowance that you will determine for your program, your organization, is not determined by ServeRI other than this range of minimum and maximum. Regardless of the living allowance you choose, our grant is providing $25,000 in funding. So the question is, well, how do we pay for additional costs? Really, the starting point is determining, well, we're going to receive $25,000 per MSY, and our living allowance costs are going to be $18,000, $20,000 per MSY. You, again, to you to select. Then you have the difference there of 7,000 or 5,000, or if all 25,000 is provided for living allowance, then there will not be any funding left from AmeriCorps to complete the project. If you are submitting a cost reimbursement grant or a fixed grant, you are going to, through that process, tell us what living allowance you're going to be providing. If you cannot meet these minimums that we have in our chart, you can ask for a waiver and explain why you've decided not to provide this living allowance, and we'll take that into consideration. While AmeriCorps members are volunteers, it's really impossible for them to volunteer every day in an ongoing way over the long term if we do not provide them with financial assistance for their housing, for their food, and for basic needs. And so while we do not pay them an hourly wage, and the amount of money that is provided to them in many cases is lower than minimum wage, we do provide them a cash stipend through these grant resources every 2 weeks or weekly, depending on your choice, so that they can dedicate themselves to your service projects. Now, it's true that in the RFP, there are a couple pages of additional requirements or expectations from ServeRI, which I encourage you to read in detail. One of them is the requirements to do national service criminal history checks, but also to participate in meetings and trainings that the State Commission holds for AmeriCorps program staff and invites AmeriCorps members to, in terms of bring AmeriCorps members together to do service together, and also to do training together and to network with each other. And those events are described in the RFP. AmeriCorps members, I mentioned earlier, at some point in this project, you need to manage or recruit additional volunteers. And we will do an annual monitoring process, to observe your program in action and help you with continuous improvement. There is both a mid-year and end-of-year grant progress report required. The RFP also identifies that from your indirect cost that you would normally receive through these grant awards, the Rhode Island Department of Education does receive 2%. Sometimes this changes to 1%, but 2% maximum of the grant that you receive is retained by the state agency for the administration of the AmeriCorps program. So 25,000 minus 2%. We're going to pause for questions. We are aiming to end by 1:30, and I haven't seen anyone use the raise hand feature. Trying to see if we feel, I will also keep this chat, and if it feels like we haven't answered a question, I will follow up with the person who asked by email. Whether you're a new or returning applicant, you still respond to this RFP and the amounts of funding that are made available. So if the amount of funding changes that's available for, say, your second year of the grant, when you submit a budget, you'll have access to the new amount of funding that has become available. So just to reiterate around covering medical costs, if an AmeriCorps member is in a full-time position, there's a requirement of, and what I mean by full-time is not how many hours they serve in a week, but the slot type of 1,700 hours. There's a requirement that the organization make available to them health insurance if they do not already have health insurance. So that cost could potentially be borne by the organization. If an AmeriCorps member is not in a 1,700 hour slot type, there is no requirement by AmeriCorps or ServeRI for the agency to provide them with health insurance. Match funding sources can be in kind. One of the most common ways that folks get match funding support is actually through personnel at site partner organizations. If there are folks who are involved in supervising the AmeriCorps members in the field, so to speak, when they're doing their service on an ongoing way, and are designated as their supervisor, but they don't work for you, the applicant at your agency, then a demonstration of the time that they spend can be an in-kind match, as well as, tangible goods, anything that would be put in a budget that you can get a receipt or statement of value for. If you have questions about documenting in-kind expenses, please contact me and we can go over the more specific rules. And we'll make sure to include that in our budget presentation. This recording will be available for sharing. We will post it at serverline.com AmeriCorps grants so that you can listen to me again. I just apologize for anyone who's doing that right now, as this webinar format is always a little strange for me, and it's going to get stranger after we've been together for an hour and we start to get tired together. All right, let's talk about a few more things, see if answer some of the questions that are coming into the chat. Just want to reiterate some things that are in the request for proposal. That is, there's a concept paper mentioned due March 1. That is important, but optional, as it says in the request for proposals. Concept paper is really an opportunity for me personally to provide detailed technical assistance to help with your final application. It's just a way for you to address some of the questions that are in the final application and to make sure that we are on the right track together. The final application is done in a system called eGrants, and that is due April 7th. Both, we'll talk about this in a second, actually, never mind. There will be a clarification period. So after your grant is reviewed by a review panel, there may be some questions, or there might be some errors that you made in the eGrants process, or information missing that we need to clarify, and we'll work with you in May to do so. So I just mentioned it's very important to stay in contact through this process. If you are really pursuing this and generally excited about becoming an AmeriCorps program, we're going to be doing some back and forth together this spring. The AmeriCorps grants are decided upon by our commission board, and we will notify applicants on May 27th, unless something happens at the federal level where we need to change that date. And grants, again, start on July 1. I see a raised hand. I'm excited. That's so fun. We have a raised hand. We're going to just do a few more things, and then I'll let you talk, Kiara. I want to make sure you understand that help's available. The concept paper is really designed to be an aid to you. Again, it's not required, but it is strongly encouraged to strengthen your final application. We will have a series of webinars that are specifically about parts of the eGrants final application that are potentially less familiar to folks who have not engaged in an AmeriCorps grant before. And they are listed in the RFP and on in the visual slide that you see. You can contact me anytime by email. And unlike some grant processes where there's a written advertisement and then sort of this formal Q&A process, or folks aren't attainable, Amanda and I are available. We do not participate in the final review of your grant application. We are here to provide help from the beginning to the end. If your question is specifically about using eGrants, which is an online federal grant system, I don't have any special access knowledge or administrative power with that system. You do need to call their tech hotline, which is referred to as the National Service Hotline, and address that issue with them. They're pretty, don't be scared. They're pretty responsive, I would say. So the RFP identifies questions that you need to answer, but the actual application instructions, if you haven't seen already, are in fact in a different document. I'll visually show them to you in a minute, but at AmeriCorps, at serverisland.com/AmeriCorps grants, you can download both the concept paper and instructions for how to complete an eGrants application that walks you through all of the steps, including creating an account with eGrants, this online system provided by AmeriCorps. So it's very important that you access the concept paper for additional instructions on that, and access the eGrants application instructions. Whereas the RFP provides the general rules and the outline of the program that we're talking about with RISE AmeriCorps, the nitty-gritty of applying is really in these other documents. Your final application in eGrants, which is, again, this online system provided by AmeriCorps, will have several different components. eGrants ask you to enter information about yourself, where you're going to be doing this service, and then it has basically, right, some empty boxes where you can paste your narrative responses. So in the application, there are a series of questions. You'll want to answer those questions in a Word document, Google document, other types of word processing out there, get your answers all together, and then paste them into this online system, which is primarily just big open empty boxes to paste your responses into. Each of these is described in the RFP in a lot more detail. In fact, what you need to say in the executive summary, what you need to tell us in the program design, including AmeriCorps member management, responding with a priority statement, how to describe your organization's capability, and what to tell us narratively about your budget. AmeriCorps also requires through eGrants that we complete a logic model in that eGrants system and enter a performance measure. Neither the logic model, the performance measure, or the budget are scored during the review process. You simply need, through the clarification process I mentioned, for you and I to agree that we've met all of the application requirements. Some of these, again, might just be errors with familiarity using e-grants, or additional information that we might ask for to put into these specific areas of e-grants that are less familiar to you, which is why we'll have separate webinars about them. I just want to mention quickly that when you're approaching this grant application, it's really important to think about what are reviewers wanting in terms of AmeriCorps. When you're describing what is going to happen, what the need is, and how you're responding, a lot of the questions are about how many AmeriCorps members will be in service? What are they going to do? What will result from their service? It's not necessarily right about your whole mission, your organization, or past programs, but what these new AmeriCorps positions are meant to achieve. And is there a reason why AmeriCorps makes sense for this project? How are you going to recruit and select these members? And what training and support will you provide them? The exact questions, again, are in the application instructions. Because at the end of the day, you are going to be recruiting, training, placing, and supervising AmeriCorps members. And the biggest challenge for first-time applicants is often not writing that you will do these things, but describing how you will do these things. How are you going to recruit individuals for these national service positions? Not what only will you train them in, but how will you train them? Will it be virtual? When will you meet? Will it be weekly? Is there a concentrated orientation? And how will you determine where they serve? Do they serve at your organization or at host sites? And how do you select those host sites? Who's going to supervise the members on a regular basis? And what does that supervision look like? These are really important elements of the application. And make sure everyone has an opportunity to understand that these applications are scored by an external review panel that's being formed now, all from folks who have had prior experience specifically with AmeriCorps. They may, in the absence of that, they will have an expertise in a specific field like education or the environment. But generally speaking, we look for former professionals from the AmeriCorps sector. These folks, at least 2 per application, will score every question that you respond to with a very basic 3-point system. You exceed the criteria that we have in mind, you meet the criteria, or you partially meet the criteria. And each section has a total point value that can add up from 0 to 100. Once these points are determined, we will rank all of the applications in order from highest to lowest, and then provide that information to the commission board, which will compare really the requests to the amount of funding available and make its decisions about what we have the capacity to support based on the funding that Congress makes available to the state of Rhode Island. Again, the logic model is not scored, but it is something that needs to be completed in eGrants. There's a template provided on our website at serverline.com/AmeriCorps grants. It is a very traditional logic model that asks you to input line by line what is the activity you're going to do, how much of that activity are you going to do, What are the results in terms of direct outputs? And what are the results in terms of a change, an outcome in knowledge, behavior, or condition? We'll have a presentation again just about logic models. It's important that you write your narratives first and use the information there really to copy and paste into your logic model. Or if you're one of those folks who strategically wants to work backwards, this can be a very useful tool to kind of outline your thinking from the beginning and enter into your application in reverse. Up to you. Every AmeriCorps application designates a performance measure, one aligned output and outcome that you will be responsible for collecting data about and reporting back to ServeRI. The performance measures can be aligned with some national standards, and there is a list of national performance measures on our website, a separate document that explains them in terms of education or the environment, first subject area, and then what are some of the standard outputs and outcomes in those areas. But you can also create your own output and outcome that we call applicant determined, and they do not have to be absolutely 100%, do not have to be what's described as a national performance measure. One of the reasons to do the concept paper is to help alert ServeRI, the ServeRI team, what you're proposing so that we can respond by helping you identify what performance measure will make the most sense, whether it aligns to something that we know is in the national performance measures, or whether, again, you need to create your own. We don't want this to be a barrier for your application. So again, this is not a scored element of your proposal, but it is something that we need to enter into the system and will become part of the accountability that you have for your grant and report on both a mid-year and end-of-year basis. Just as an example to understand what is he talking about, we'll use an education example. So if you're serving students in an education setting, there is a specific national performance measure built into e-grants designated, there's no way to know this without digging into it. ED1A, the number of individuals served, in this case, students receiving an education service. And then the purpose of your service is to have some change effect and outcome on those students. And there are different ones identified in the national performance measures, one of which is improved academic performance. So you build out a description of what that improvement is and how you're going to measure it when you complete your performance measures. If you are submitting an AmeriCorps application, you are also going to be including a budget. There are different budget types. If you have a fixed grant application, the RISE AmeriCorps fixed grant, the RISE Professional Corps fixed grant, versus a planning grant or an intermediary grant, which are cost reimbursement based. And we have worksheet templates, again, on our web sheet to help you develop that budget before you try and go to e-grants and enter the information there. Again, we will hold an entire presentation just on budgets in the near future. But if you're doing a cost reimbursement grant, you're going to detail the personnel and fringe benefits that they receive for this AmeriCorps program. any travel, training costs, supplies that might be provided to staff or the AmeriCorps members as part of this project, what living allowance will be given to AmeriCorps members, and the cost of criminal history checks. There is in the application instruction very specific information about what needs to be included there. The RFP also mentions that there are additional documents mandatory for all who are applying to AmeriCorps. One is a management survey. This is something that you give to folks in the finance office as it addresses things like whether or not you have an audit and what are some of your accounting procedures. There's also a new federal requirement called the diversity questionnaire. The diversity questionnaire asks you to consider what is the diversity of your staff, your board, and the folks that you serve, both through the potential AmeriCorps program and through your entire organization. As this is a new requirement, there's also in every question they ask an option to say none reported, or the version of like, we don't know the answer to your question, and that's perfectly acceptable. But we do need the diversity questionnaire completed. And again, as I've said so many times, at serverisland.com/AmeriCorps grants, you'll find that diversity questionnaire. You may also submit by email with your application by April 7th optional documents. If you are describing to us an evaluation that was done previously about your program, you can send us that evaluation. If you are working in a space with labor unions, if you know that you're delinquent on a federal debt, the RFP describes information you need to provide. Or if your agency has an indirect cost rate agreement, this is something that organizations that receive many grants from the federal government may have. You need to give us a copy of the letter that states what that rate agreement is so that we can verify it. But I just want to finally say, as we hit time, that I'm sure this all seems very simple and you're all ready to apply now. But I know seriously that there are many documents, and there's a new online system called eGrants that you're going to need to navigate. And we really encourage you to reach out with questions, to take advantage of the additional webinars, or to send questions by email so that we can assist you. At the end of the day, what makes this more complicated than your traditional request for funding is that this is fundamentally about people power, and RISE AmeriCorps is not just a financial grant, it's a human resource. And a lot of the information that's asked, a lot of the systems that are built out are about organizing the human resource aspects of this program. We strongly believe that AmeriCorps can be a catalyst to achieve more of your mission, and we're here to help you. Hopefully our technical assistance goes well beyond the usual sort of grant maker, grantee walls, and I look forward to getting to know you and your organization better. And I'm going to stop talking. I'm gonna, there was previously a hand raised, so I'm going to, some folks have left, I won't take that personally. You do not need to speak, but you are being given permission to speak now. If anyone wants to unmute themselves and ask a question, we will be able to hear it. You've been given that sort of technological access. while I wait to see if anyone does raise a question, I want to point out hopefully you're seeing our website right now. And I mentioned, 1,000 times the webpage, which I imagine you've navigated to serverline.com/AmeriCorps grants, where all of the things I mentioned earlier are here: the request for proposal, the concept paper, the application instructions, the ability to register for future webinars, the next one being February 25th, and all of the resources in terms of budget templates, logic model templates, etc. Are there any questions? Well, I'm going to hold on for a couple more minutes and invite you to leave the meeting if you're all set.